I am going to talk about this project that we did looking at misogyny, hostile beliefs, and the transmission of terrorism. It is a specific project, but I also think it's useful. At RUSI, I'm lucky to work on a team that we do a lot of looking at gender dynamics of violent extremism, and it's useful to zoom out for a second, I think, to think about the context of why we have to keep discussing why it's important to think about gender. And I think I'm still constantly answering this question of why is this important? Why should we be talking about it? What does it mean? Are we just talking about women? These questions are still very common in this space across various sectors of the sort of security institutions involved in this space. And I think that's largely historically because the security institutions have been set up in a system, in an international relations system that is gender blind, right? I think it's easy to forget that while some of us are really trying very hard to emphasize the gender dynamics of terrorism and violent extremism and engagement in conflicts, that largely security institutions are still operating in a gender blind function, and there's not very much data on which to base your argument, right? That this is important to do, that we need to be doing this, and it tends to be a kind of cyclical trap to fall into. If you don't have the data, then you can't use it to prove to somebody who doesn't believe that you should be looking at this, that we need to look at it. So then they don't authorize the funding and the time and the effort to then gather the data that you need to prove it to them. So we're still kind of stuck in this circle of why this is a struggle. And I think it's important to keep coming back to this, that we don't need to keep explaining, or I hope we can get to a point where we don't need to keep explaining why this is important, but rather we can really dig into these important issues about how gender and gender norms and gender role expectations drive how and why and where people get involved in violent extremism. And it's all people. It's not just women, it's not just men, it's everyone. So this project is sort of one of a suite of projects that we've been working on over the last many years, looking at these dynamics, and this project specifically looked at the question of how does misogyny and sort of the gendered narratives of the far right. So I'll switch over to sort of the far right question. How does it serve as potentially a mobilizing factor, a factor of transmission across different far right narratives, across different, across white supremacists or anti-government or ethno-nationalists, but also how does it serve as sort of a transmission factor across different contexts? So far right is an umbrella term that I do not love because I think sometimes we're not all talking about the same thing when we use terms like that, but it also, most far-right umbrella sort of ideologies, they're really grounded in a local context. There is a local context to what the challenge is, what they're responding to. But we also know that they're connected transnationally in online spaces, we know that the narratives are shared across from different, the United States of America is exporting far-right narratives to the world right now. There are shared elements, and misogyny we have really found to be one of these key linking shared elements. And I think it's useful to remember that we need to be careful not to silo these conversations about women and misogyny. And I think in the international conversation around gender mainstreaming, we tend to sort of pendulum swing from what we talk about. It was sort of, okay, let's talk about gender. Yes, this is important. Okay, now let's focus on women. And yes, this is important to the context of the last 15 years of counterterrorism. And now we're swinging to, okay, misogyny is important. Let's talk about this. But they're all important. And I think we have to keep them all in view at the same time as they apply across different ideological perspectives, as they apply across different contexts, as they apply in Africa versus the Middle East versus North America versus Western Europe. There's a little bit of this everywhere, and I think that's an important thing to remember as we look, and especially as we look forward in the online space, to sort of where we're moving, future threats, and how these become blurred, how it's easy to, the gender dynamics of this can help us understand some of the nuance and understand how they're connected and how they're blurring together, and perhaps help us then unpack solutions that can better address some of the sort of mixed ideologies and the future of where we might see violent extremist threats coming from. I didn't take my time. I'm looking at your time now. So this project, this specific project was specifically looking at we did a comparison across the United Kingdom and Australia. We had RUSI is a think tank based in London, and we had a partner based in Australia, Monash University, and we did a project comparing the two contexts. And you might think that the far-right scenes are similar, and they were maybe less similar than you might think, but we compared the two contexts, and we looked at the far-right narratives in the two contexts. So first we sort of broke down basically a set of looking at how misogyny is present across far-right ideologies. So we looked at how misogyny is present in white supremacy, how misogyny is present in ethno-nationalism and anti-government sentiments, how misogyny can be a standalone identity, a standalone ideological purpose in sort of far-rights. A lot of talk about incels now. So we looked across how misogyny was part of each of these sort of expressions of far-right extremism, and then we also looked across the spectrum of sort of what we call the manosphere. I don't know, is that a familiar term in this room? It probably is for most. The manosphere is sort of a soup of sexism online, and it can is that a bad way to explain it? A soup of sexism? Okay. It's a space that exists in the online world where there is all varieties and sort of as a spectrum of severity of sort of sexism to misogyny to outright, very much, it is a space of hate-based discrimination that can feed into a space that feeds to extremism, then feeds to violent extremism. So we looked from sort of the spectrum, the end of the spectrum that is, hate-based discrimination, all the way up to where that feeds into what we would call violent extremism or far-right terrorism. Clear acts of neo-Nazi, white supremacy, clear acts of terrorism. So we looked across those, and then we looked across the context of what's prominently far-right issues in the UK versus what's in Australia, and sort of asked how misogyny or how the gender dynamics of those contexts could be better understood or help us better understand how they're communicating with each other and spreading across those spaces. Make sure I click everywhere. So the methodology of the project was we did this literature review thinking about how misogyny fit into these concepts of far-right extremism and the concepts of the spectrum of sort of sexism to misogyny. And then we did a data scraping of a period of 5 years on Telegram and Stormfront of looking at channels that were dedicated to conversations about UK far-right extremism and Australian far-right extremism. And we looked at sort of the post-Charlottesville, USA incident because it kind of changed the nature of the online conversation a little bit around far-right extremism. We scraped channels that were open due to ethical concerns and to make sure that it was replicable, that people could find again what we looked at. And then we grouped them into two basically corpora of language that we scraped off of these channels. One was the UK sort of focus context and one is the Australian context so that we could then kind of compare the two of them. Some brilliant colleagues of mine worked very hard to do some corpus linguistics looks at the data that we gathered. We used what we would call a neutral language data set to sort of compare how often neutral language is used against language that is extreme in nature. We gathered a horrible list of a taxonomy of language that is language that's used, a gendered language that's used in these forum to describe what they felt were the prominent issues in their local contexts. And we compared those to each other. We compared how frequently those words appeared. We then compared the context of those words in the wider conversation happening around them to sort of get an idea of how much the gendered element was present in these narratives. And it was amazing how much it was. It's often a way that people in these spaces identify, whether or not they're talking about gendered issues, it's a way that they label what they fear almost. We found sort of the gender dynamics in the UK ended up being very focused on sort of anti-immigration. A lot of the Western European narratives appeared in the UK far-right expressions, whereas the gender dynamics in Australia tended to focused more on anti-vax at the time when we finished the project, imported a lot more of the American sort of far-right conversation in the Australian context. And so they were talking about different things, but they were sort of gendering it and sexualizing it in the same way, in the same languages, which really, it brought us to the conclusion that we sort of found that misogyny did play a key role across these contexts, right? They weren't necessarily talking about the same outgroup, but they were talking about different outgroups in the same way, and it was gendered language and how they were doing it. And this misogyny element, where they perhaps, this group in Australia, the primary, neo-Nazi was the primary concern in Australia, versus in the UK, other elements of sort of anti-government sort of expressions of anti-immigration sentiment maybe were of more prominence in these channels, but they could speak to each other because they both understood this language of misogyny, and that helped them communicate, and unfortunately, it helped the transmission of extremism across the two spaces. They were then able to share a conversation because of that shared expression of gendered nature. So it's not great. It's not great that that's how they're sharing across contexts, but it can help us as practitioners then understand how to respond, because you have to respond with a focus on the local context, but you can also respond with a better understanding then of how these contexts connect to each other through the gendered nature of their language, of the way that they form the in-group, out-group expressions within their local context. And I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into too much more detail, but I will say sort of that the findings of this project connected to other projects that we have been working on, looking even across non-Western areas of concern for far-right extremism. I know often when we talk about far-right extremism, we tend to focus on Western Europe, North America, white supremacy. But looking at some non-Western cases of far-right extremism around the world, we found in those that even it was the anti-gender sort of narratives, anti-feminist narratives, the anti-LGBTQ+ that connected. And it was very different local contexts, very different expressions of far-right extremism, but it was those gendered narratives, the misogyny that connected them together, and that they shared across their different, they shared that narrative across their different local contexts. So it is I think, a useful way for us to think about adding to our use of gender, our understanding of gender, our mainstreaming of gender across projects, to really use this as a way to think about connections, to think about helping practitioners to understand how these different disparate ideologies are speaking to each other in a way through these gendered narratives. And it's important that we factor this into our, I think, understanding of what gender mainstreaming needs to look like as we're doing counterterrorism and preventing and countering violent extremism projects. I will just skip over all of these other slides. This is the project. I do have a QR code today, yeah. This is the project resources for that particular project. And then, of course, my team at RUSI, you can find more information about us as well.